Let me hit you with a question real fast. What happens when you get a miniature and it just isn't quite up to the standard you expected? This is what happened in 2018 when I received the miniatures that came with the pre-order for Fallout 76. At this point in time I had stopped building and painting Warhammer altogether and thought that these figures might give me the inspiration to pick up the brush again. Instead, I was confronted with figures that were more like toys rather than wargaming models, and they ended up being exiled to the dark abyss of a cupboard that doesn't get opened. Nearly 6 years later, I have come back to miniature building and painting, and I must delicately balance the early stages of hobbying with a tight budget, and these figures are still in exile. With a more open mind, perhaps there is some potential here, an opportunity to practice some skills. This is Cursed Crusader Arts. The first thing I noticed here is that these miniatures are made with a soft plastic that is likely made with some silicone, resulting in a mould that bends. This means that we have a piece that will not snap when we use it, but we lose details in the mould and could suffer with some parts being bent, such as the gun in the right hand. This frustration is exacerbated by missing or incorrect details, such as the supporting bar on the helmet that connects the earpiece to the drop-down visor that is standard issue with the T-51 power armor. The other glaring issue with detail is that these suits, designed for humans, are missing digits in their hands. The other major issue I have is with the pose. The figure is stood with a wide stance and their elbows tucked in so much that they are literally connected to the body of the figure. This means that the chances of separating the arms and repositioning them is not really a viable option. The head is staring straight forwards, not really looking at anything or giving some mood or energy to the model. The left hand has nothing in it, making the missing digit I mentioned earlier painfully obvious. I think there is supposed to be something in the hand, perhaps a grenade, but it isn't very clear and the pose does nothing to suggest this theory. The final thing to take note of is that this Wasteland survivor is equipped with a plasma rifle in their right hand. This could be interesting if handled properly. These obstacles need to be overcome to make this figure a little more interesting. My main bugbear is the missing digits on the hands, so rummaging around some spare parts that somehow managed to avoid the Great Miniature Purge, I found some spare parts from an earlier iteration of Space Marines. The hands on these parts are much larger than the ones that we have now, but are perfect for this power armor from the Fallout universe. Luckily, there is one for each side, and there is even a mean looking knife on the hand that would be replacing the empty left hand. I also have some wire and small nails that could be very useful, and my initial idea was to modify one of these nails into a screwdriver that was being used as a makeshift knife. I needed to make this character interesting and believable, so some research would be needed in order to support my ideas. A good paint scheme alone would not be enough to transform this model sufficiently enough, so I needed to do something about the pose. I can't really remove and replace too much of the model as I said before, but what I can do is add something to it in order to break up the symmetry. I had this idea that perhaps this particular set of power armor had been looted by a raider and modified to their own twisted ends. Raiders often add layers of rebar to the shoulders of their power armor in order to add more sheets of metal, both to add protection from the mutated creatures of the wasteland, but to also look larger and more intimidating. Drilling some holes into the shoulder pad would allow me to cut and add some wire to represent this concept. I've never really added wire to a figure before other than to make banner poles, so I struggled to get the angular bends that I was really looking for. So instead I would bend and warp this wire throughout the entire process to make the rebar seem like it had been beaten into place, because that's pretty much what I had to do. With one shoulder now larger than the other, the symmetry was being broken, but I still needed to sell the raider theme a little more. I had an idea that this raider might be a bit of a punk, and wanted to add something to their armour that would set them apart, making it clear who they were. And then it came to me. A clear image in my mind had me drilling holes in the helmet and adding 3 nails to make a demented Mohican. This idea came from the Warhammer Dwarf Slayer Snorri Nosebiter, who had driven nails into his skull when he took the Slayer's Oath instead of having the typical Slayer Mohican. Our character is coming together nicely now, and I needed to attach the hands. The plastic for the new hands was extremely hard. Perhaps it was because of what they had been made with all those years ago, or perhaps they had hardened over time. Either way, the hands would be pinned and superglued into place, but not before I cut off the knife and reattached it in a reverse or ice pick grip, so that the raider could stab their enemy with the full power and strength that the power armor would provide. I also cut a rectangle into the bottom of the plasma rifle and cut away at the new hand until they fit nicely together. This figure now had a lot more character to it than what it started with, and the soft plastic gave me another idea. Perhaps I could take advantage of this in order to carve into it with my knife, and because it was so soft, it was considerably safer than if I had tried to do the same thing with the harder plastic and resins that we would normally have in wargaming miniatures. What if we had a raider that was on their last legs, standing not so much in a defensive stance, but more of a defiant one in the face of impossible odds? So I carved 4 large trenches into the pristine power armor chest and cut some chunks out of the left shoulder pad. I added some tiny scratches across all of the armor and found that the plastic would heal in a similar manner to our cutting mats, but I was hoping that some of these scratches would come up later on in the painting process to help show a more battered set of armor. I had envisioned that this raider had been ambushed by a Deathclaw, the apex predator of the wasteland. This raider had been mortally wounded by the claws that shredded their armor like paper, and their rifle was also out of ammo, and all they had left was a small knife to defend themselves with. Death was inevitable, but it was better to die on your feet than whimpering in fear. I hope you found this video interesting. This was an opportunity to overcome some of the obstacles presented by a miniature that didn't turn up quite as nicely as we expected, and turn it into something better. We identified many problems, but also found some interesting properties of the miniature that we would not normally see. I plan to paint this armor up in the winterized paint job, and perhaps create an interesting base for it to sit in. This figure came with 2 identical copies and a myriad of other creatures and characters from the Fallout universe, so if you'd like to see what I do with them, subscribe, and let me know what you would do with this figure.